Here's a question worth sitting with for a second before you answer it. If you had to cut your spending hard starting today, what's the one expense you'd protect no matter what? Not the practical one, not rent, not groceries, not the electric bill. The one that isn't necessary by any reasonable definition and that you'd still fight to keep. Most budgeting advice assumes the honest answer is nothing, that real discipline means everything's on the table, and the version of you who sticks to a budget is the version who's willing to cut anything. But that's not actually how sustainable budgeting works for most people. It's not how it worked for Victor either, once he stopped trying to be that version of himself and started paying attention to what actually held his budget up. This is a difference between decorating a budget and building one, and why the expense you refuse to cut might be the reason the rest of it survives. Victor's budget overhaul starts the way most of them do. A spreadsheet, a hard look at the last 3 months, and the long list of things that have to go. Streaming subscriptions he barely watches, the takeout habit that's crept up 2 nights a week, the clothes he buys when he's stressed instead of when he needs them. All fair game, all easy enough to admit to. Then he gets to the climbing gym. $45 a month, plus the odd $20 here and there for a new pair of shoes or a day pass when he travels. On paper, it's the easiest cut on the whole list. He could absolutely survive without it, and the math would look cleaner without that line item sitting there every month. He tries it anyway, cancels the membership, tells himself it's temporary, just until the budget's back under control. For the first week, it barely registers. By the second week, something's off in a way he can't quite name. He's more irritable after work, quicker to snap at small things, and strangely spending money in places he didn't expect to. A takeout order he didn't plan, an impulse buy at the drugstore that has nothing to do with climbing at all. He goes back to the spreadsheet, confused, because the numbers say he's doing better. The biggest recurring expense is gone, but everything about the month feels worse. He's not saving with any more ease than before. If anything, he's white-knuckling the rest of the budget in a way he wasn't before he cut the climbing gym. It takes him a few more weeks to notice the actual pattern. The money he saved by canceling didn't stay saved. It leaked out somewhere else, in smaller, less visible ways. Almost as if his budget needed somewhere for that energy to go, and climbing had quietly been the place it used to go instead. There's a structural way to think about what happened, and it has nothing to do with willpower. A budget isn't just a list of expenses ranked by necessity. Some expenses are decorative, nice to have, easy to remove without the rest of the structure shifting. And some expenses are load-bearing, not because they're essential to survival, but because they're quietly doing the psychological work that makes the rest of the discipline possible. Willpower isn't an unlimited resource you spend evenly across every decision in your day. It depletes with use, the same muscle drawn on whether you're resisting a purchase, holding your temper, or pushing through a hard conversation. Every act of restriction pulls from the same pool. A budget that asks for restraint in 20 categories at once is asking that same tired muscle to fire 20 times a day, with nothing built in to let it recover. The climbing gym wasn't decorative for Victor, it was the release valve. 2 nights a week, he got to spend effort on something hard and physical instead of something restrictive, and that release quietly recharged the willpower he spent everywhere else, at the grocery store, in front of a sale email, at happy hour with friends who were ordering a second round he wasn't. Take away the valve and the pressure doesn't disappear. It just finds a new, less examined place to escape. A takeout order, a drugstore impulse buy, the exact kind of small replacement spending Victor didn't plan for and didn't recognize as related. This is why a technically optimal budget can fail, even when every individual cut is defensible on paper. The spreadsheet sees $45 a month with no clear return. It doesn't see that the $45 was propping up every other line item's compliance. Cut the wrong expense, and you don't just lose that expense. You quietly weaken the whole structure's ability to hold, because the thing keeping the willpower topped up is gone, and the rest of the budget has to run on a battery nobody's recharging anymore. The uncomfortable insight is that the expense most worth protecting is rarely the cheapest one, or the most defensible one, or the one anyone else would guess. It's whichever one is actually doing the load-bearing work. And that's something only the person living inside their own budget can identify, because it doesn't show up as a line item labeled psychological recovery. It just shows up as the thing you fight hardest to keep for reasons that don't sound entirely rational when you say them out loud. Left uncorrected, this plays out in one of two ways, and neither looks like the dramatic budget failure people picture. The first is what happened to Victor at first. The load-bearing expense gets cut in the name of discipline, and the savings quietly evaporate into smaller, harder-to-track spending elsewhere. Spending that doesn't show up as a lapse because it never gets flagged as related to the thing that was actually cut. The budget looks more disciplined on paper and performs worse in practice, and the person doing it has no idea why, because the connection between the missing release valve and the leaking replacement spending is almost never obvious in the moment. The second is quieter and slower. The person keeps the load-bearing expense, but carries a low hum of guilt about it, because it doesn't look justifiable next to everything else they've cut. That guilt doesn't make them cut it. It just makes them enjoy it less, second-guess it constantly, and treat something that's actually structurally necessary as if it were a personal failing they're getting away with, which is its own quiet cost, even when the money keeps flowing to the right place. Either way, the actual sustainable version of the budget never gets built, because the one piece of information that would have made it work, which expense is decorative and which is load-bearing, never gets identified on purpose. It just gets discovered by accident, the hard way, after a cut that should have worked doesn't. The fix isn't to protect everything you enjoy, and it isn't to cut everything that isn't strictly necessary. It's to deliberately find your one or two load-bearing expenses, protect them on purpose, and cut everywhere else without guilt or negotiation. Here's a concrete way to do that. Run a 2-week cut everything experiment first. Before deciding what to protect, temporarily cut every non-essential expense for 2 weeks. Yes, including the thing you suspect matters most. This isn't the plan, it's the diagnostic. You're not trying to survive on this budget long term, you're trying to see, in real time, where the pressure escapes when there's nowhere sanctioned for it to go. Pay close attention to any new, small, unplanned spending that shows up during those 2 weeks. That's very often the leak, and the leak points directly at what you actually cut too aggressively. Ask what the expense is doing, not what it costs. For anything you're tempted to protect, ask a specific question. Does this recharge something I spend elsewhere? Patience, restraint, energy? Or is it just something I like that costs money? Both are valid categories, but only the first one is load-bearing in the structural sense. The climbing gym passed this test for Victor because its absence visibly weakened his discipline everywhere else. A subscription he barely watches doesn't pass it because nothing else in his budget got harder to hold once it was gone. Protect the load-bearing expense explicitly, in writing, before you build the rest of the budget. Don't leave it as an unspoken exception you feel guilty about. Write it into the budget as a fixed, non-negotiable line, the same way rent is non-negotiable, because functionally, for your ability to stick to everything else, it is. This removes the daily relitigation of whether you deserve to keep it, which is its own drain on the same limited willpower you're trying to protect in the first place. Cut everywhere else without negotiation, precisely because you've already protected the one thing that needed protecting. Once the load-bearing expense is locked in and guilt-free, the rest of the budget can be genuinely strict. The takeout, the impulse close, the subscriptions, because you're not asking the same tired muscle to hold the line on 20 fronts with no recovery built in anywhere. You're asking it to hold the line everywhere except the one place it gets to rest. Revisit the designation periodically, not the expense itself. Once every few months, check whether the thing you protected is still doing the job. Sometimes a load-bearing expense changes as life changes, and something else quietly becomes the real release valve. The goal isn't loyalty to a specific expense forever, it's staying honest about which one is actually structural right now, rather than defending it out of habit long after it's stopped doing the work. None of this is about spending more or finding a clever loophole to keep everything you like. It's about being precise instead of uniform, cutting hard where cutting is free, and protecting on purpose the one place where cutting would have quietly cost you everything else. Victor reinstates the climbing gym membership and runs the 2-week experiment properly this time, cutting everything else hard, believing the one expense he now suspects is load-bearing untouched, and watching closely. The difference shows up almost immediately. The unplanned takeout orders stop. The drugstore impulse buys stop. He's cutting just as aggressively everywhere else, skipping the streaming subscriptions, cooking instead of ordering out, holding the line at happy hour. And it doesn't feel like the same uphill fight it did the month he tried cutting everything, including the gym, all at once. He writes the membership into his budget as a fixed line, the same category as rent and utilities, and stops mentally negotiating with himself about whether he deserves it every time the charge goes through. A friend, the same spreadsheet-minded one who originally suggested cutting it as the obvious easy line item, raises an eyebrow when Victor explains the reasoning. Victor doesn't argue the math. He just points out that the month he cut it, he spent more overall, not less. The number the spreadsheet couldn't see was the one that mattered most. 3 months later, at his periodic check-in with himself, he notices something worth naming. Climbing is still doing the job, still the thing that makes the rest of the discipline hold. But he also notices a Sunday morning ritual, a specific, unhurried coffee at the same small cafe near his apartment, quietly becoming almost as load-bearing. The one slow, guilt-free hour in a week otherwise full of restraint. He doesn't cut either. He just makes a note to watch it, because knowing which expense is actually holding the structure up isn't the one-time discovery. It's something worth checking on, the same way you'd check that an actual wall was still doing its job. There's a version of financial discipline that treats every bit of joy as suspicious. Proof if you enjoy spending on something that you haven't cut deep enough yet. That version sounds rigorous. In practice, it's often the least sustainable one, because it asks the same tired part of you to hold every single line at once, with nowhere built in to recover. The more honest version of discipline isn't about cutting everything equally. It's about knowing precisely what you're protecting and why, so that the cutting you do everywhere else can actually be sustained instead of white-knuckled. A budget with one load-bearing joy left standing on purpose isn't a budget with a loophole in it. It's a budget that understands its own architecture well enough to know which wall is actually holding the roof up. The goal was never to want less. It was to be precise about what you're protecting, so the rest of the structure doesn't quietly fall down around it.